January 30th, 1944, beachhead of Anzio, Italy. That morning, the general of the 14th Panzer Division had assured his officers, "These bunkers stand up to anything." The reinforced concrete, thick as a bank vault, had been designed to withstand any Allied artillery. Nothing would cross those walls. But what the German army called invulnerable was about to disappear in seconds, and with it, the very reliance on the Reich's defensive engineering. The weapon responsible for this sudden silence came not from the skies nor from the tanks, but from behind the lines, pulled by tractors, mounted with cranes, supplied by miles of logistics. It was the American 240mm Howitzer, a super-heavy artillery piece that not only pulverized concrete but annihilated doctrines. Its strength lay not only in the explosion, but in the calculated accuracy. A cannon that spoke the language of industry and whose vocabulary was exact destruction. This video reconstructs with facts, figures, and testimonies the transformation of a military belief into operational panic, a weapon designed to fight bunkers, which ended up destroying an entire idea. Because that winter, the Germans discovered that no shelter is safe when the enemy is American mathematics. But before we dive into the data, there is a statistic that defines this story with brutal simplicity. Between 1944 and 1945, the United States fired 118,429 shells from 240mm howitzers at German fortifications. The result, 3,114 bunkers totally destroyed, 489 unusable at an accuracy rate of 81%. No catastrophic failures recorded. While Germany relied on concrete and arrogance, America responded with steel, calculation, and scale production. The bang was terrifying, but what really caused panic was what came after. Absolute silence. No response on the radios, no survivors in the shelters, no confidence in the next fortification. If you value the well-told story, based on records, testimonies, and war engineering, please consider supporting this project. Your like and subscription allow these stories, and the numbers that change the world, to never be forgotten. In 1938, during the last phases of the construction of the Siegfried Line, a German engineer proudly watched the laying of the last layers of concrete over a command bunker in the western sector of the Rhineland. According to the calculations of the TOT organization, that shelter could withstand the direct impact of 210mm shells and withstand entire days under continuous fire. It was the pinnacle of Third Reich defensive engineering, inspired by the bastions of World War I and the belief that reinforced concrete was still the final arbiter of a land war. Every square meter of wall, every interconnected firing range, every armor embedded in the foundations represented not only physical protection, but a symbol of technical mastery. The German doctrine did not provide for mass mobility or adaptation. It bet on permanent solidity, the idea that the enemy would exhaust itself against its walls. Over 390 miles between the Netherlands and Switzerland, more than 18,000 bunkers, pillboxes, machine gun nests and command positions were erected, all operating under a single concept: the inviolability of the shelter. Fortitude was the soul of strategy. General Alfred Jodl himself, at a meeting of the High Command in 1940, stated that no known ground force will be able to penetrate our fortified lines without paying an intolerable price. German confidence was endorsed by heavy engineering, the use of cast iron, hardened steel, and high-strength concrete. In theory, they were right. In theory. But what Berlin did not foresee was that, on the other side of the Atlantic, a completely different philosophy was at work. While the Germans built each concrete block with artisanal precision, the Americans built factories that replicated on an industrial scale what had previously been the exception. And not just factories, but a complete system of supply, transportation, coordination, and execution. A difference in military philosophy was beginning to take shape. The Germans designed fortifications that took months to complete. The Americans, by contrast, designed means to eliminate fortifications in minutes. This absolute reliance on fortifications extended to Italy. When Axis forces fortified the slopes of Futa Pass in the Apennine Mountains, they believed they had created the modern equivalent of an impenetrable wall. Excavated caves, reinforced platforms, intertwined bunkers. The terrain was difficult, the altitude made air raids difficult, and the access routes were covered in booby traps. Wehrmacht reports described these positions as perfectly defensible against any conventional force. No field weapon in the American arsenal, Not even the consecrated 155mm cannons would be enough to dismantle those structures. And this was the essential flaw of the German doctrine. It completely underestimated the US ability not only to create a new weapon, but to produce, transport, and sustain it on an operational scale. Here it is worth a pause. By 1944, while Germany was consolidating bunkers with walls up to 5 meters thick, the United States was producing 13 240mm Howitzers per month. The Watervliet arsenal in New York alone employed more than 9,000 workers in 3 continuous shifts. Each howitzer cost the equivalent of 12 Sherman tanks, and yet 315 complete units were manufactured before the end of the war. Germany produced only 8 24mm K3 railway super-heavy guns in the entire conflict, a statistic ignored by Berlin and which would change the course of the war. If this number surprises you, write in the comments, logistics wins. German war architecture, built with the slowness of a castle and the vanity of a monument, would collapse under the weight of a new American artillery that not only fired, but hit. And this was the second German miscalculation. They believed that weapons of this caliber would be limited to railroad artillery, rail-dependent, fixed, slow. The memory of the French guns of the First World War still shaped his predictions. They did not count on the American ingenuity of creating a system that would allow them to tow, assemble, and position a 65-ton piece with crawler drive, recoil pit digging, and specialized cranes, all in less than 8 hours. They did not have 360 lb howitzers firing at 23,000 yards with timed fuses and delayed penetration projectiles. They did not count, finally, on the fact that a stationary fortress would always be overcome by a moving projectile. When the first bunkers began to collapse, it was not only concrete that gave way, it was ideology. Because the entire German defense system, from the Atlantic to the Dolomites, had been built on the idea that the shelter, once finished, would always be superior to the attack. They forgot to ask, what if the attack evolves faster than the shelter? This question would begin to be answered in January 1944, on the beaches of Anzio, when the first 240mm howitzer would be fired in combat. But before that, there was still time for one more illusion, because until that day in the maps and manuals, everything still made sense. Up until that day, German engineers still believed they had designed the perfect bunker. And then, at 2:30 p.m., the ground shook, and nothing would ever be the same as before. In 1940, as Europe burned under the Blitzkrieg, a series of reports began to worry U.S. Army strategists. The modern fortifications that were being built in Germany, occupied France, and northern Italy had features that completely defied the attack patterns then in use. Tests conducted by the Army Ordnance Department confirmed the worst-case scenario. The 155mm shells, then the largest caliber of American field artillery, were effective only against light targets or makeshift shelters. Against high-performance reinforced concrete, such as those used by the Wehrmacht, its effectiveness was marginal. It was possible to cause cracks, superficial damage, shaking, but not total destruction. The internal conclusion was straightforward and at the same time devastating. American artillery could not reliably break through German defenses. It was urgently necessary to create something new. Not a symbolic cannon like the railroad monsters of the First World War, but an operational, mobile piece of continuous production. The challenge was twofold: power without sacrificing mobility, precision without compromising industrial scale. The answer would come not from a lone visionary, but from a collective machine, the Watervliet Arsenal. Founded in 1813 and situated in New York State, the arsenal was already one of the oldest and most respected centers of artillery manufacturing in the United States. But the design of the M1 240mm would require a new level. The initial technical specifications seemed unrealistic. A howitzer capable of firing 360-pound shells at more than 23,000 yards, with enough accuracy to hit specific structures and enough force to penetrate up to 2 meters of reinforced concrete. In addition, the entire system had to be mobile, operable in the field, and with components that could be manufactured on a large scale by civilian contractors. It was essentially engineering applied to the doctrine of surgical artillery. What started as an idea was translated in the following months into steel. The first prototype was completed in November 1942. It weighed 64,700 pounds in firing position. The pipe alone measured almost 11 meters and weighed more than 10 tons. To transport it, it was necessary to develop a six-wheeled reinforced trailer with special suspension. Each unit required an M2 crane, a trench excavator, mud traction vehicles, electric generators, a maintenance crew, and most importantly, a perfectly coordinated 14-man crew. But the structure worked. Unlike large-caliber German guns such as the Dora, K5 or K3, which relied on rails, locomotives, and weeks of preparation, the M1 could be disassembled, moved, and repositioned in less than a day. Assembly time dropped from an initial 8 hours to just over 4, with crews trained. The secret wasn't just in the gun, it was in the system. The arsenal adopted standardized machining, calibration, and quality control processes, which allowed it to manufacture cannons with minimum tolerances, interchangeable parts, and easy maintenance. Each 4140 special steel tube was subjected to 847 machining operations, including heat treatment in furnaces up to 1,500 degrees Celsius, precision drilling, and overpressure-proof firing. Only two 240mm howitzers failed acceptance tests throughout the war, both due to flaws in the recoil system, which were promptly corrected. The reliability was absolute. This reliability was the real differentiator. The US Army wasn't looking for a gun that would elicit admiration in parades. It was looking for a gun that worked every time, that could be made by hundreds, operated by ordinary soldiers, and fired with mathematical consistency. A piece that, placed on the field, repeated the same result, the complete destruction of a bunker. The doctrine was not theoretical. Tests showed that with a direct shot of 240 meters, it was possible to eliminate fortified structures with up to 6 feet of concrete. The M17 penetration projectile, with a hardened steel cap and a delayed fuse, pierced the concrete before detonating. The kinetic energy at the inlet exceeded 2.8 million foot-pounds. The internal explosion caused so-called sympathetic fracturing, disintegrating the walls from the inside, even when the bunker resisted externally. The visual result was unmistakable: a clean impact, a tremor in the ground, and a hole where there had once been a structure. But the weapon alone did not win wars. It was necessary to mass-produce it, move it, feed it, and sustain it in any environment. And that's exactly where the United States demonstrated the real difference. By 1943, the arsenal was producing 6 units per month. In 1944, it jumped to 13. In 1945, even with the war in its final months, it was still producing 10 M1 howitzers per month, with monthly stocks of up to 35,000 240mm shells. The entire logistics chain has been adapted to support this effort. Liberty ships carried up to 500 shells per trip. Red Ball Express trucks have created dedicated routes with reinforced suspension. Mobile workshops did the maintenance in the field. Ammunition officers controlled stockpiles by radio. Allied engineering wasn't just military, it was industrial. What the German High Command saw as a technical problem, penetrating concrete, the Americans treated as a problem of flow, scale, and repetition. And it was this repetition that destroyed German beliefs. A bunker was falling, then another, then 5 more. And when they realized, what seemed like exceptions became the rule. The 240mm M1 was not the most sophisticated weapon of the war, but it was the one that delivered with precision the same result, dozens of times a day, hundreds a month. It was predictable, and that was his greatest terror. This new doctrine, based on serial strength and predictable destruction, would make its combat debut on the Italian coast in the hands of the 697th Field Artillery Battalion, and the target, a bunker that, until then, was described in reports as indestructible. At 2:30 p.m., on January 30th, 1944, the German silence was broken by an explosion that would forever change the war of fortifications. January 30th, 1944. Anzio, west coast of Italy. The sea was calm, the sky cloudy, and the battlefield had stabilized in a defensive stalemate. The Allied forces, trapped between the sea and the Italian hills, faced fierce resistance from the Wehrmacht's 14th Field Division. The Germans occupied fortified positions, dug precisely along the access routes. on natural elevations protected by reinforced concrete shelters. They had at their disposal camouflaged pillboxes, networks of crossed machine guns, and protected ammunition depots. General Alfred Schlemm, commander of the German forces on that front, had stated 2 days earlier, "These positions can hold off any attempt at advance for at least 6 weeks." But at 2:30 p.m. that day, a bang changed the nature of the war in that sector, and perhaps on the entire Western Front. The U.S. 697th Field Artillery Battalion, positioned 21,000 yards from the objective, fired the first 240mm howitzer in actual combat. The target was a command bunker identified by aerial reconnaissance and confirmed by forward observers. In less than 40 seconds, the projectile crossed the sky, entered the structure from the east side, and detonated with an internal force equivalent to 360 kilograms of TNT, completely collapsing the shelter. No survivors, no radio, no response. The bunker disappeared from the map and from doctrine. In the following minutes, Allied observers reported the beginning of an unusual pattern: disorganized smoke signals coming from German positions, irregular movement, and the sudden interruption of transmissions that had been constant until then. American intelligence interpreted the event as a tactical success, but the impact went much further. Prisoners captured that day recounted a phrase that would begin to be repeated in the following months: "They have a new cannon, a cannon that swallows stone." Rumors spread among the German platoons that the Americans were using seismic bombs or some experimental weapon brought from England. A report by the German 2nd Army Corps, intercepted by cryptographers in February, classified the impact as an artilleric phenomenon of unknown origin, with total demolition power in heavy protection structures. For the first time, bunkers, a symbol of security, were associated with certain death. What he was supposed to protect now sealed his fate. Over the next few days, 9 more 240mm rounds were recorded by the 697th Battalion, all with selected targets: ammunition depots, radio centers, and fortified positions. In 8 of them, the effect was the same. No target resisted. No bunkers remained operational. More importantly, the Germans began abandoning shelters even before any actual attack. The mere sighting of Allied forward observers, with radio equipment and detailed maps, was enough to generate unauthorized displacements. In military terms, this phenomenon was classified as preventive rupture of defensive position. In simple terms, panic. The fear of the gun was as effective as the gun itself. This fear was not unfounded. Each 240mm howitzer traveled at nearly 2,500 feet per second and followed a parabolic trajectory that reached altitudes in excess of 30,000 feet before descending accurately over the target. The time between firing and impact varied between 45 and 55 seconds, depending on the distance and propellant load. This meant that the soldiers inside the bunkers had less than a minute between hearing the initial sound and facing the destruction. But there was not always sound. With the right wind, the speed of the projectile, added to the noise confusion of the battlefield, often completely concealed its approach. The impact was sudden, absolute, and final. The Germans nicknamed him the Phantom Hammer, but the real irony manifested itself when Allied field engineers examined the wreckage of the first bunkers destroyed. They found that many of them had double walls, internal reinforcements, structural setback systems, and even shock absorbers, all based on the expectation of withstanding impacts of 155mm. None of this had made a difference. The kinetic energy of the internal explosion exceeded by 600% what any bunker had been designed to withstand. The fortification didn't just fail, it amplified the effect. The contained concrete transformed the impact into a lethal echo chamber. The shelter became an oven. The cracks didn't leak air, they collapsed the oxygen. The attempt at protection became a sentence. In February, German commanders in the Anzio region ordered the redeployment of fortified positions to areas with lower air visibility and greater ground mobility. The doctrine was being rewritten in real time under fire. In just 3 weeks of operation, the M1 howitzer had caused more change in German defensive tactics than a full year of conventional bombing. The Allies, on the other hand, gained confidence. The 697th Battalion began to be strategically repositioned, with a special escort, priority logistical support, and dedicated intelligence. Targets were no longer random. They were surgical. One bunker at a time, one impact per shot, one doctrine less. In March, a German general captured in the Cisterna region would confess during interrogation, "We lost command of the land when you gained control of the maps. We no longer knew where it was safe. And when you don't know where it's safe, everything turns into death." This phrase would be transcribed into American textbooks as an example of the moral efficacy of the M1. It wasn't just a weapon of destruction, it was a psychological dismantler. But what happened in Anzio was just the beginning. Because while the Italian bunkers were collapsing, the 240mm howitzers were about to climb the mountains. And on the rocks of Monte Cassino, the ultimate symbol of Europe's historic fortification, the next lesson was about to be taught with fire and calculation. High on an Italian hill, 18,000 yards from the target, an American officer with M7A1 binoculars adjusted his position under cover of branches and camouflage nets. At his side, an SCR-610 radio operator wrote down coordinates, adjusted frequencies, and maintained direct contact with the 697th Battalion's Fire Direction Center, FDC. It was February 3, 1944, and a newly identified German bunker, dug into a rocky hillside, had just been marked for disposal. But it would not be an artillery barrage. There would not be dozens of shots at random. The American philosophy was different. A target, a calculation, a shot. What appeared to be just a colossal cannon was actually the apex of a technical network that blended advanced cartography, precision ballistics, and real-time coordination. Each shot of the M1 was not the result of a brute order, but of a mathematical process conducted by field engineers. The FDC received the data from the observers, consulted specific ballistic tables, adjusted it by the curvature of the Earth, by the local atmospheric conditions, by the density of the air, and issued the final solution: angle of elevation, propellant load, fuse time. The result wasn't a scattered explosion, it was an incision. This method contrasted sharply with competing doctrines. The Soviets, for example, preferred volume, saturating the area with dozens or hundreds of rounds in an approach known as steel barrier. The Germans, on the other hand, relied on visual precision and acoustic sensors, but with a decentralized structure and vulnerable communication. The American system was different because it integrated everything: tactical aerial reconnaissance, forward observers on the ground, short and long-range radios, mobile fire direction centers, and artillery pieces trained to act as extensions of the same brain. The SCR-610, with a range of up to 15 miles in open terrain, allowed for real-time fire adjustments, something unthinkable in World War I. Instead of shooting to scare, the Americans shot to put out, and they erased exactly. This qualitative leap created a new kind of psychological warfare. German soldiers no longer feared the arrival of a barrage. They feared silence. The moment the Allied radio activated, the spreadsheet was calculated, and a single projectile came, invisible, accurate. In interrogations conducted by the 34th Infantry Division, German prisoners revealed a new behavior: fear of the observer. They called him a ghost with a radio. A man lying in the bushes with binoculars and antenna was able to bring down a structure that had taken 3 months to build. It was the lone operator who brought serial destruction. This model didn't just require technology, it required doctrine. And American doctrine was based on trained efficiency. Each FDC team followed a standardized protocol with technical manuals updated monthly. The calculations were made with an M16 slide rule, topographic maps in scale 1/25,000, and data provided by weather balloons launched every 6 hours. Air temperature, atmospheric pressure, the angle of inclination of the terrain, and even the type of soil were taken into account. Mathematics replaced instinct. Science replaced volume. The howitzer was no longer just an artillery piece and became the tip of an intellectual chain of destruction. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. The Germans, with all their engineering tradition, had the technical means to create something similar, but they were stuck in a logic of vertical, slow, and inflexible command. The dispersion of communications, the fear of error, the bureaucratic weight, and the belief in the concrete as the final solution prevented them from reacting quickly. Meanwhile, the Americans delegated, tested, corrected, perfected. The FDC system was a living organism, which learned with each shot. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts, show your support, like and subscribe, so we can bring you more in-depth content about the hidden gears of victory. And the results began to pile up. Between January and April 1944, the 697th Battalion alone recorded 127 rounds of 240 Howitzer with fixed targets. Of these, 119 hit the primary target with full effectiveness, a success rate of 93.7%. Never before in any war had a super-heavy artillery achieved this level of accuracy. The concept of suppression fire was replaced by elimination fire. Each shot justified its cost. Each impact changed the terrain. Each target destroyed represented a break in enemy morale, and a silent affirmation that modern warfare was fought not just with force, but with correct numbers. But that accuracy would have its greatest test a few miles to the south, on a rocky elevation crowned by a millennia-old abbey. The M1's next target was not just a bunker, it was a symbol, a monument, a bastion, and its destruction would shake not only the battlefield, but the entire world. Monte Cassino was waiting, May 1944. The Liri Valley, south of Rome, had become a graveyard of failed strategies. High on the hill overlooking the landscape, Monte Cassino Abbey stood as an undisturbed symbol, millennia-old, sacred, and now militarized. Although the monks had been evacuated months earlier, the monastery and its surroundings had become the defensive core of the Gustav Line, the last major German barrier in central Italy. Dug between rocks and sacred earth, the monastery's surroundings housed camouflaged casemates, ammunition depots under medieval structures, and artillery positions that dominated all access routes. There, amid relics and crosses, German engineering believed it had created an impenetrable bastion. It was the pinnacle of defensive doctrine, a spiritual, geographical, and military stronghold. The first Allied attacks failed. British, New Zealand, and Indian forces were repulsed with devastating losses. The abbey seemed invincible, and the idea that conventional howitzers could dislodge the Germans was dismissed as naive. But what the German generals did not anticipate was the quiet arrival of an American engineering battalion and the installation 20 kilometers away of 6 firing platforms of the M1 240mm in just 72 hours of operation between May 11th and 14, US. Heavy howitzers fired 79 shots at positions previously mapped by aerial reconnaissance and ground observers. The target was not the monastery, but its surroundings. Bunker entrances dug under escarpments, observation points in the middle of the ruins, underground tunnel intersections. Each impact was preceded by calculations of wind, humidity, relative altitude, and rotation of the earth. The M112 ammunition carried delayed action fuses to penetrate the rock cover before detonating. The effect was immediate. What seemed untouchable began to fragment. British General Harold Alexander, visiting the Southern Front on the 13th, commented in an almost skeptical tone, "The hill shakes as if it had lost its own foundation." A day later, the 4th Indian Division, while trying to advance on a previously closed flank, found 12 entire bunkers destroyed. No resistance, no gunfire, no survivors. This type of result was not common in 1944. The war was still largely based on saturation fire, attrition, and frontal assaults. But Monte Cassino marked a turning point. Allied offensive engineering surpassed, for the first time, the survivability of German defensive engineering. The terrain, which should favor the defenders, began to imprison them. With escape routes blocked by landslides caused by the explosions, many bunkers have become death traps. An intercepted report from the Wehrmacht's 1st Paratrooper Division described the situation as collapse of the inner perimeter by underground overpressure. In practice, the explosions in sequence were eroding the bases, supporting the fortifications. Entire structures sank, toppled over, or lost connection to the support tunnels. What he once protected, now he arrested. The devastation was not just physical, it was symbolic. Monte Cassino had withstood centuries of invasions, earthquakes, feudal battles, but it did not resist the mathematics applied by American engineers with slide rules and projectiles forged in series. The force that broke through his defensive line was not the heroism of a frontal assault, but the impersonal precision of efficient logistics. British officers who witnessed the operation were baffled by the synergy between gunners, radio operators, and surveyors. Major General John Harding stated in an internal dispatch, "I have never seen such specific destruction with so little waste. Each impact was a sentence. There was no luck or chance." The operation culminated in the capture of the ruins on May 18th. The Polish forces, advancing down the shattered flank, met only scattered resistance. Of the 39 active bunkers identified around the monastery, 34 had been completely destroyed by the 240mm salvos. 4 were damaged to the point of being abandoned. Only 1 remained functional, but had already been evacuated the day before. The sum of destroyed targets, added to the low need for firing, represented an unprecedented efficiency in heavy field artillery. What was once an impregnable mountain was now a pile of rubble with blocked entrances, unused positions, and disoriented soldiers. The empire of defensive engineering, so carefully shaped by German doctrine since the Siegfried Line, was beginning to crumble not by excess of force, but by excess of precision. And it was in this collapse that a new perception emerged, which went beyond the limits of Monte Cassino. If the fortifications were no longer secure, what was still? If neither altitude nor concrete nor history could contain the fire of a rationalized industry, what remained for Germany was to run or disappear. The doctrine of friction had been replaced by the doctrine of calculation, and the next target, even more symbolic, would not just be a hill, it would be a country, because just past Monte Cassino, the 240mm Howitzers would cross France and head straight to the heart of the Siegfried Line. With each new 240mm howitzer that crossed the European sky, there was a hidden story, not on the battlefield, but inside factories, foundries, and workshops scattered across the United States. In order for a single M1 to be ready for combat, it was necessary to extract, shape, calibrate, and assemble 65 tons of special steel, a high-strength alloy treated with carbon and molybdenum, capable of withstanding pressures of 40,000 psi. Each corrugated tube went through 847 machining operations, precision axial drilling, induction heat treatment, micro-tolerance grinding, and application of anti-friction inner layers. The complete process took an average of 72 hours of machine, not counting assembly time and ballistic tests. And yet, between 1942 and 1945, the United States produced 315 of these pieces, an average of 2 a week, for 3 consecutive years. The secret was not in the genius of an engineer, but in the invisible structure that supported them, a national production chain in which metallurgy, transportation, logistics, and human labor operated as a single cog. The Watervliet Arsenal, which was responsible for the core of the project, coordinated a network of more than 80 secondary factories. Every screw, every sealant, every component of the recoil chamber was produced to exacting specifications by civilian companies transformed into arms of the war industry. The production of the 240mm projectiles, in turn, was the responsibility of the Frankfurt Arsenal in Philadelphia and the Iowa Ordnance Plant, which in 1945 would manufacture 10,000 units per month. This meant that every 3 minutes a new howitzer was born, a 360-pound steel explosive shell with thermal tolerance, ballistic stability, and a programmable fuse. But the numbers, as impressive as they were, did not tell the most symbolic part of the story. 35% of the workforce involved in this effort was made up of women. In the absence of millions of men sent to Europe and the Pacific, American factories were occupied by trained female workers, many of whom had never worked with metal before the war. They were mothers, teachers, clerks. Within a few months, they became experts in precision cutting, MIG welding, balancing hydraulic systems, and inspecting micro-cracks. While the Germans bet on wonder weapons, such as the V-2 rocket, technologically innovative but logistically unfeasible, the Americans bet on reliable repetition. It didn't matter how beautiful the M1 was, it mattered that it worked, that it could be transported, assembled, and fired in rain, snow, or sand. It was the victory of the predictable over the improbable, from scale over eccentricity. The industrial chain behind the howitzer was not limited to manufacturing. Each piece had a technical manual with 12 sections. Each shell was tracked from the point of casting to the field. All cargo sent to Europe underwent pressure and endurance tests. The Navy created exclusive routes for the transport of the components. 10th Army Logistics developed a mobile crane rotation system that reduced installation time at the front by 40%. Even the grease used on the axles of the trailers has been modified to withstand the temperatures of Alsace's winter fields. It was a war won in the details. While the Third Reich, as early as 1944, diverted resources to elite projects such as the Maus tank or the Dora cannon, the United States manufactured devastation in series. Each German bunker destroyed was not just a tactical victory, it was the confirmation that an entire nation, from the high command to the factory floor, was operating in sync. This synchrony revealed the deepest flaw in the enemy's doctrine. Germany believed that it could compensate for numerical inferiority with localized technical superiority. It relied on a few extraordinary pieces of equipment, operated by trained elites. But modern warfare had changed. What defined the outcome was not the most powerful weapon. It was the most reliable weapon in greater quantity, sustained by logistics, repair, resupply. And in this, the United States had become unbeatable. A 240mm howitzer was collapsible, transportable, reusable. With each shot, the system absorbed the impact, rearmed, adjusted, and prepared the next shot in less than 3 minutes. It was a choreography of efficiency. This model was not only superior, it was morally corrosive to the enemy, because every time the Germans heard an impact, they knew another one would come, and that no matter how reinforced the fortification was, no matter how thick the concrete, the destruction would come, not by chance, but for sure. This certainty, repeated thousands of times, corroded any doctrine based on exceptionality. The Third Reich built its image on invulnerability, and now that image was crumbling. Not in the face of experimental weapons, but in the face of standardized American production. But this machine of destruction still had a lot to show, because after Italy and France, the Howitzers would cross the Rhine and finally face the great symbol of German defensive arrogance, the Siegfried Line. And there, where Germany was betting its last concrete wall, the Americans would give their definitive answer in steel, calculation, and fire. July 1944. After weeks of fighting trapped between hedgerows and villages in Normandy, the Allies were finally preparing the breaking blow. They called it Operation Cobra. The goal was clear: to break through the German defenses in the western sector and pave the way for the liberation of France. But among the Allied generals, one point of resistance lingered like a boulder in the middle of the road: Hill 122, a fortified hill that dominated the field of vision for dozens of miles around. The Germans had turned the terrain into a modern fortress. Bunkers staggered in concentric rings, crossed machine guns, anti-tank mines, escape tunnels. The 3rd Paratrooper Division, one of the most experienced at the front, occupied the position with absolute confidence. Its commanders had been told that no Allied piece has the range or power to dislodge us from here. This phrase would last only until sunrise on July 25th. At 06:32 a.m., the 697th Artillery Battalion positioned its batteries 17,000 yards off the hill. Aerial reconnaissance had marked 7 priority points of resistance. The orders were simple: total neutralization. The Fire Direction Center's calculations were carried out with updated data from a weather balloon launched at 04 EE. At 07:01, the first 240mm howitzer cut through the Norman sky. The impact hit a double shelter with concrete reinforcement 1.20 meters thick. Nothing remained. Within 5 minutes, another 6 shells had found their targets: a communications shelter, a mortar position, an observation point at a high level. The entire hill began to collapse, not as a military target, but as an organism that was losing its vital functions. When the American infantry advanced 3 hours later, they met only isolated resistance. More than 60% of the garrison had fled even before the final impact. American intelligence would later report that the simple positioning of forward observers on the flanks of Hill 122 had provoked the evacuation of part of the line. German troops, seeing antennas being raised or maps being opened, concluded that the invisible cannons were on their way, and they acted before. It was a new kind of power, fear as a multiplier of efficiency. In later interrogations, German soldiers reported that the noise of American radios was the true sound of the end. A sergeant in the 352nd Division stated, If they pointed the binoculars and were silent, we knew it was a matter of minutes. The howitzer no longer needed to be fired to win. It was enough to be feared, and this fear was justified. Between July and September 1944, just 3 battalions equipped with M1 caused the complete destruction of 284 German fortified positions in France. The average number of shots per bunker destroyed was less than 2. A staggering statistic, and one that the Germans simply ignored. As they tried to strengthen their positions with more concrete and steel reinforcements, the Americans responded accurately at scale. To give you an idea, while Germany produced about 9,000 pieces of heavy artillery in 1944, the United States exceeded 60,000 units in the same period, 6 times as many. If you were surprised by this data, comment below. Logistics wins. Because that's exactly what was happening. American logistical superiority was winning even before direct combat. During Operation Cobra, the battle logic changed. The Allied advance was no longer made on the basis of terrain, but on the basis of calculation. The command determined the target. The FDC calculated. The howitzer was falling, and only then did the infantry move. This cycle of predictable destruction undermined any attempt at static defense. The doctrine of holding positions to the end was replaced by the Germans by a doctrine of preemptive retreat. Bunkers, once points of resistance, have become psychological traps. German soldiers began to refuse fixed shelters, preferring temporary trenches, even at the risk of exposure. An American General Staff report in August 1944 concluded, the 240mm artillery does not only eliminate targets, it removes the notion of security. And there was more, because after the liberation of Saint-Lô, the paths were open to something much greater. The advance would now move towards the heart of the Reich. The howitzers would cross the Seine, reach Alsace, and position themselves in front of West Germany's largest bastion of defense, a name that still commanded respect, but would soon become synonymous with collapse. The Siegfried Line awaited them, and the American howitzers were ready to teach her the true meaning of obsolescence. September 1944. The Allied forces had crossed France like a hot blade on old cloth. In front of them stretched Germany's last great defensive bastion, the Siegfried Line. Known to the Germans as West Wall, it was a belt of more than 630 kilometers of continuous fortifications, reinforced concrete bunkers, anti-tank moats and interconnected firing ranges. Each structure had been built with obsessive technical rigidity, walls between 4 and 8 feet thick, internal armor, hidden secondary exits. What the Germans called the shield of the fatherland was in theory an insurmountable obstacle, but the theory would not stand up to the reality of a new type of artillery. On September 8th, at 06:15, the U.S. 265th Field Artillery Battalion began a pre-planned mission against a 5-kilometer segment of Siegfried near Zweibrücken. Within 6 hours, 19 of the 22 primary targets had been completely destroyed. What decades of construction promised in resistance, a few dozen shots dissolved into rubble. The operation combined tactical aerial observation with geodetic mapping. Each bunker had been previously analyzed for thickness, composition, and structural vulnerability. The shots were distributed among shelter entrances, ventilation points, and internal command zones. The M1 howitzer, with its programmable fuse, was set to detonate within 2 meters of impact, enough to break through the outer layers and collapse the core. The result was not only physical destruction, it was the collapse of trust. A bunker that had taken weeks to build was being eliminated in minutes, with near-clinical accuracy. The repeated sound of the impacts, interspersed with long silences, was not the noise of combat. It was the announcement that the German defensive doctrine itself had been overcome. The most revealing would come in the following days. Documents intercepted from the Wehrmacht High Command instructed infantry battalions to avoid occupying bunkers in sectors exposed to large-caliber American artillery. For the first time in the entire war, the use of a fortification came to be considered an operational weakness. Positions that once meant safety have become synonymous with trapping. German officers began to use open trenches, improvised camouflage, and constant movement in an attempt to avoid fixed targets. The U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff has noticed the change, and he adapted. If before the M1 were used to neutralize targets, now they started to shape behaviors. It was no longer just artillery. It was psychological control of the field. The strategic impact was as profound as the tactical. The Siegfried Line was designed as a barrier. Now I didn't stop it, I channeled. With each new section attacked, a corridor of advance was opened. And the most serious, the German commanders could not replace her. There was no time, material or men to erect new fortifications. The Reich engineers, once celebrated as pillars of resistance, became witnesses to the failure of their own work. General Hans Speidel, in a report to Gerd von Rundstedt, wrote, "The concrete is useless when the Americans shoot mathematics." It was the recognition that it was no longer about bravery, but about system. The industrial, logistical, and technical system of the United States had made the very idea of the defensive line obsolete. Even the elite of the German army began to retreat in the face of the inevitability of collapse. The 212th Grenadier Division, sent to reinforce the Pirmasens sector, refused to occupy the designated bunkers. In their testimonies, prisoners reported that it was better to face the open field than to be buried inside the shelter. By October, German resistance was already fragmented. American artillery, supported by real-time weather data and new radar techniques, guided the howitzers with a margin of error of less than 12 meters. The targets were no longer fortifications. They became the morals, the doctrine, the very sense of protection. When American engineers prepared the next offensive, they knew they would no longer face the concrete wall. They would face something much more fragile, German confidence, because the next step would not be to destroy bunkers. It would be crossing the border itself. And what was left of defensive Germany was about to fall apart. The American advance into Germany revealed something that no doctrine, no manual, and no defense plan predicted. The bunker, once an absolute symbol of protection and trust, had turned into a concrete nightmare. The first signs appeared in the medical reports of units set back after the fall of the Siegfried Line. Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS soldiers began to show symptoms of disorientation, involuntary tremors, panic attacks, and catatonic silence after long hours in stricken fortifications, even as they physically survived the impacts. A captain of the 9th Armored Division reported finding 2 German officers inside a partially collapsed shelter. Both were alive, armed but motionless, eyes glazed over without any reaction. When they were removed, they could no longer form coherent sentences. What the Americans called the precision strike for the Germans had become something deeper, a rupture of the instinct for self-preservation. German military medicine, already worn out by the scarcity of resources, began to register what would later be identified as a unique phenomenon of World War II, bunker syndrome. Studies conducted in the 1950s by psychiatrist Bernhard Jürgen, a former Wehrmacht health officer, pointed out that soldiers subjected to heavy bombardments in closed shelters developed a complex neuropsychological picture. Symptoms included seismophobia, dread of vibrations in the ground, claustrophobia, absolute rejection of enclosed spaces, and phonophobia, violent reaction to sudden high-pitched sounds. A survivor from the Prüm sector, hit by 14 rounds of 240 mm howitzers in 30 minutes, reported years later that every crack of wood or knock of a door threw me back to that place, where I didn't know if it was still human or just concrete waiting to break. The most shocking thing was the speed with which these traumas took hold. A young man of the 352nd Infantry Division, captured 3 days after the loss of his fortified position, declared that he would rather die in the open than re-enter a bunker. He had survived 3 direct heavy artillery hits. In the third, he was partially buried. During the interrogation, he repeated a single phrase, "The ceiling breathes. The ceiling breathes." The perception that the structures that were supposed to protect them were alive and about to kill them took on the contours of a collective hallucination. War, at that point, ceased to be physical. It became neurological. The Americans had unknowingly unleashed a new kind of devastation. Not because of the intensity, the Soviets, for example, used much larger volumes of artillery, but because of the precise predictability. The sound of a single American radio adjusting coordinates was the mathematical harbinger of an impact that would come exactly where it was supposed to. The absence of errors reinforced the terror. Unlike saturation bombings, where there was at least room for hope, the M1 shots gave no margin. One shot, one target. A bunker, a sentence. And more than that, the absence of warning. The projectile was traveling at more than 700 km/h with no noticeable sound until impact. Many German soldiers did not even know they were being shot at. They just woke up between stones and screams. When they woke up, the American observation system amplified this feeling of powerlessness. Binoculars, balloons, reconnaissance planes. A small reflection on the horizon could mean that the countdown had begun. The enemy was no longer visible. He was invisible, accurate, and omnipresent. A diary recovered on the outskirts of Saarbrücken, belonging to an engineering warrant officer, contained a telling passage. The sky is clear, the radio is muted, but silence weighs like lead. Here, silence kills. The psychology of war was allied to the physics of impact. German morale sank faster than the concrete of its own bunkers. Allied medical reports also recorded the phenomenon. American doctors who treated unarmed prisoners noticed the recurrence of defensive reflexes, men who threw themselves on the ground when they heard the sound of a simple jeep engine, or who refused to enter any room without windows. It was an atavistic panic, shaped not only by experience but by the repetition of experience, as if the brain had learned that shelter is no longer a place of escape, but the last place before the end. In certain cases, there have been records of preventive suicides. German soldiers isolated in besieged fortified posts preferred to take their own lives rather than wait for the collapse. For them, the howitzer was inevitable, and there was no heroism in waiting for him. Military historian Ernst Vogel, in his 1967 analysis of the last months of the Western Front, wrote, "What the Allies destroyed with their howitzers were not only positions, it was the concept of shelter. Concrete, which has sustained the German war since 1939, has come to symbolize inevitable death. This transformation from a symbol of security into an icon of panic was, perhaps, the quietest and most decisive turn of the ground campaign against the Reich. The fortress had become an echo chamber, and what she repeated in each seismic shock was the new order of the battlefield. But the real symbol of psychological surrender was yet to come. Because the war, even in the face of all this emotional collapse, continued, and in the coming months, faced with the Allied advance over the Ruhr Valley, the German engineers themselves would be forced to make an unprecedented decision, to demolish their own bunkers before they were used against them, and in doing so they would seal the supreme irony of this story, to build with pride, to destroy with despair. Amid the colossal machinery of industrialized warfare, the accuracy of the 240mm M1 was not just the fruit of steel, gunpowder, and ballistic calculations. It was, above all, the reflection of the sweat and discipline of men who lived around that piece, like monks around an altar. Sergeant David Mathesy of the 697th Artillery Battalion recorded in his campaign diary, "We are not just snipers, we are part of the weapon. Every gear, every voice, every arm pushing the projectile into the breach, it's all part of the impact that no one sees." Mathesy and his colleagues did not have the privilege of emotional distance. Unlike the bombers or the officers of the General Staff, they were there next to the destruction they produced. The routine was physical, timed, strenuous. 12 men per piece, 3 shifts, relay every 45 minutes. And even then, his hands bled on the tracks. His eardrums buzzed after each shot. His body vibrated as if he had received part of the shock of the impact. Each shot was a hammer in the bone. Preparing for a single shot required surgical coordination. Lieutenant Harold Saunders, in charge of the calculation and observation section, described the process as a dance without music. "I shout the number. They move. One spins the cannon. Another adjusts the angle. 2 line cartridge. 1 inspects the fuse. In 30 seconds the monster breathes." And then came the quietest moment. The pause. The sound of the radio with the order of fire, the gaze fixed on the instruments, the distant impact, and silence again. There was no applause, no relief. Just the next calculation, the next target. The weight of what was done was never forgotten, only suspended. It was not uncommon to see soldiers from the 265th and 697th weeping in silence after a particularly devastating mission. Not out of regret, but out of moral exhaustion. The precision of his actions meant that lives were over in seconds. They didn't see the bodies, but they saw the maps before and after. They knew where the command posts, the reserves, the medical sections were. Each impact reached more than concrete. Sergeant William Keel recalled, "You learn not to think, because if you think too much it freezes, and if it crashes, someone dies because you hesitated. The war required not only calculation, but emotional detachment, a methodical disconnect between the act and the consequence. The crew of the M1 handled weapons that weighed almost as much as a light tank. The main shell of the howitzer required a mobile crane to be assembled. The recoil rails had to be greased every 3 shots. The hydraulic damping system had to be replenished with each mission. Any failure put the team at risk. The tube heated up to the point of causing burns with minimal contact. The sound of the gunshot could cause partial deafness after a few weeks without adequate hearing protection. And yet, crews volunteered to keep going, not for glory, but out of awareness of their role. The contrast was brutal. To the Germans, the M1 was an unseen legend, the earthquake cannon. For the operators, it was a meticulous, demanding and impersonal instrument. The terror it caused was a consequence, not an objective. And this gulf between perception and operation created a moral dissonance that few could endure for long. Many of the gunners who operated the M1 were sidelined after bouts of anxiety, tremors and nightmares. Others, like Saunders, developed an almost religious fixation on shooting perfection. If we are going to kill, let it be exactly. No mistake, no prolonged pain. A clean cut, he would write in a letter to his wife in December 1944. Life between missions was almost monastic. The pieces were cleaned with wire brushes. The fuses were inspected under red light so as not to attract enemy aviation. The shells were stacked like bricks from a steel cathedral. The shooting range was measured and measured. And in the middle of it all there were letters from home, photographs pinned to the walls of the tents, discreet jokes between breaks. Humanity persisted, but always in the shadow of the next mission. The moral impact was not limited to those who operated. The forward observers, often ignored in war narratives, were the invisible eyes of destruction. Positioned a few kilometers from the enemy, they were the ones who decided where and when the impact would occur. With SCR 610 radios, millimeter-graded binoculars, and real-time topographic maps, observers were trained to suppress any hesitation. Private James Otley of the 18th Corps reported, "When you see a figure move behind a bunker, you calculate. You don't think if he's a father, if he's afraid, if he's praying. You just calculate." And after the calculation came the order, and with it, silence. Despite all this weight, there was a conscience among these men. What they did prevented bloodier combat. Each bunker destroyed by artillery was one less trench for the infantry to traverse. Each collapsed position was a saved flank. They did not see themselves as executioners, but as hands of an inevitable clock, one that moved with the precision of the industry, but at the emotional cost of those who made it work. War there was not only made of steel, it was made of tired arms, red eyes and hands that learned to carry death with the delicacy of a ritual. But even this ritual would have to reinvent itself, because the Allied advance was about to face a new challenge, no longer the fortress, but the city. The concrete of the bunkers would give way to the concrete of the urban centers, and there, where destruction needed to be selective, the M1 would have to prove that it was also capable of winning with millimeter precision within the labyrinths of stone and history. As the Allied front approached the mountains of southern Germany and the fortified valleys of Italy, many believed that geography would bring a respite from destruction. Dense forests, steep slopes, natural caves and rock formations promised a new kind of protection. The German High Command bet on geography as its last shield. What they did not foresee was that, for the American artillery, each new obstacle was only a variable to be solved. The 697th and 265th Artillery Battalions, already veterans of Italy and France, led one of the most discreet and most lethal evolutions of modern warfare, the adaptation of the 240 meters M1 for warfare in complex terrain. Gunners quickly learned to exploit the resources of their own environment. They adjusted the firing angles to hit targets hidden under forest canopies. They implemented proximity fuses, sensors that detonated the projectile meters from the ground, ensuring an airburst, devastating even without direct contact. Box-shaped shots coordinated by 3 or 4 pieces, firing with slight variations in angle and timing, turned clearings into craters and caves into inverted traps. The Aosta Valley in northern Italy was the first practical laboratory of this doctrine. A cluster of caves occupied by the 114th Jaeger Division had become a point of resistance that not even the medium bombers could dislodge. The main entrance was protected by massive rocks and anti-tank guns. The only solution was a staggered firing pattern with fuses programmed to detonate at the entrance to the cave. The explosion did not destroy the shelter. It suffocated those inside. The air was consumed. The temperature rose beyond 300 degrees Celsius, and the survivors were forced out the side of the mountain, directly into the American lines. In less than 12 hours, the entire position had been neutralized. In the forests of Hürtgen, the challenges have become even more specific. The dense canopies deflected conventional projectiles. The Germans dug positions among deep roots and camouflaged cannons in hollow logs. The answer was the creation of altimetric maps integrated with aerial observation. The result? Coordinated shots that penetrated the canopy through natural cracks and detonated meters above the ground. The impact was vertical, scattering shrapnel like a rain of steel. Elite German units, such as the 275th Infantry Regiment, began to report severe casualties even without direct engagement. One captured officer wrote, "The enemy sees without being seen. He shoots without being heard. And he kills without being touched." It was also in these forests that the US introduced the tactical use of dual-time fuse-fired projectiles, a combination of aerial detonation with a delay in the final impact. The projectile exploded in the air and, if there was no significant impact, activated a second stage when it touched the ground. One howitzer, two effects. It was the kind of adaptation that only a flexible industry could offer. Meanwhile, the Reich continued to try to repair damaged parts, with no ability to alter its doctrine or modernize armaments in the field. Germany in 1945 was stuck with what worked in 1940, but the battlefield was no longer the same. And here it is worth pausing to reflect on the difference between effort and result. By 1944, while Germany was producing about 250 pieces of heavy artillery per month, the United States was manufacturing more than 1,000 to 800, including 250 heavy howitzers like the M1. What's more, the US had spare parts stockpiles, parallel assembly lines, and mobile maintenance teams. The difference between the two powers was not only in volume, it was about flexibility, response time, logistical adaptation. If this comparison surprised you, comment here with one word: logistics wins. The impact was profound, even in the way the Germans began to resist. The traditional defense in fixed fortifications was replaced by mobile ambushes, but these also became ineffective in the face of the Americans' ability to anticipate patterns and adjust fire based on new data. When the soldiers of the 2nd Mountain Division approached Brenner Pass in late March 1945, they were told that the 240 mm artillery had already mapped points of resistance invisible to the naked eye. The landscape, once an advantage, had become a deciphered code. The natural had become predictable. It is at this point that war ceases to be a sequence of battles and becomes a matter of learning. The US wasn't just winning by firepower, it was winning by continuous adaptation. Each attack revealed a flaw. Each failure became an adjustment. Every adjustment a new advantage. It was a cycle of improvement sustained by a structure that went from the ground to the top of the chain of command. And meanwhile, the Germans remained stuck with a model that, while brilliant in its time, could no longer react to the speed of events. American engineering, once seen as too functional, now proved to be superior precisely for this reason, for transforming each hostile terrain into a laboratory of efficiency. In the Wehrmacht archives, there is a memorandum dated April 1945, issued by an artillery officer stationed in Bavaria. The final sentence sums up what the German soldiers felt at that moment. "We no longer know where the fire comes from. We only know that it will come." And that feeling, the inevitability of destruction, would mark the transition to the next chapter. Because what was about to happen was no longer the destruction of fortresses. It was the implosion of entire cities. And for the first time, the American howitzer would cross the gates of the heart of the Reich. With the imminent collapse of borders, Germany has used its last defensive card, turning cities into fortresses. Aschaffenburg, in the heart of Bavaria, was chosen as the ultimate example of this doctrine. An entire urban fabric was transformed into a military stronghold. Concrete windows, underground tunnels connecting buildings, command centers installed in schools, barricades made with the remains of dynamited bridges. The Germans believed that the narrow and dense urban fabric would be immune to large-caliber artillery. After all, How to fire a 240mm projectile with enough accuracy to hit a bunker in the basement of a building without destroying the entire block. But that's exactly what the Americans managed to do. At 0740 on the morning of 28 March 1945, 3 pieces of the M1 were positioned at elevations outside the visual radius of the city. With topographic data, aerial photogrammetric maps and ballistic calculations refined by field meteorologists, the first shot hit the command center of the 1067th Volkssturm Regiment, located in the reinforced basement of the former Bellevue Hotel. 2 shots later, the entire building collapsed vertically, with no damage to the structures next door. The concept of ballistic surgery had been validated. Over the next 90 minutes, more than 40 shots were fired at 90-second intervals. Each shot had coordinates refined by advanced observers infiltrated 2 kilometers from the city. These men, equipped with SCR-300 radios and multi-prism binoculars, updated in real time the detected resistance position. The pattern was simple: sighting, calculation, shooting, silence. One block after another, Aschaffenburg was losing its command centers, communication centers, and logistical nodes, and with that, it also lost the cohesion of the defense. At 09:20 a.m., the U.S. 45th Infantry Division entered the city without facing organized resistance. German officers were captured inside the rubble, stunned, still holding maps where command points had been marked as invulnerable. The success of the operation encouraged the immediate application of the same protocol in an even more symbolic city, Nuremberg, the ideological cradle of the Third Reich, City of Laws, 1935, stage of Nazi rallies. Nuremberg was more than fortified. It was armored by a concept. The German command believed that its medieval architecture, reinforced with modern concrete, transformed its walls and winding streets into a labyrinth of resistance. Anti-tank nodes were placed on all access roads, mines in open squares, machine gun nests between Roman columns. But once again, American logic prevailed. The 265th Battalion was activated with data obtained by night aerial reconnaissance. Within 24 hours, they designed an attack plan based on impact zones delimited to 50 square meters. What seemed impossible was accomplished with mathematical precision. 3 battalions operating simultaneously, firing from different points, adjusting angles to create impact vectors that bypassed preserved civilian zones. In 36 hours, 117 shots hit primary targets, including underground depots, interconnected bunkers under the Reichsparteitagsgelände, and radio centers. Each impact calculated to produce vertical collapses, minimizing lateral scattering of the shock wave. And perhaps the most symbolic, the shot that hit directly the entrance of the former Zeppelinfeld, destroying the podium where Hitler had spoken years earlier. American artillery didn't just eliminate targets, it deconstructed symbols. The accuracy of the M1 was not only military, it was narrative. He turned every shot into a statement. Not even the ideological center of the war was unreachable. The success at Nuremberg forced a revision in German estimates on the use of heavy artillery in urban environments. Seized documents reveal a desperate attempt to redesign urban doctrine at the last minute. Internal reports called for the evacuation of civilian centers and the transfer of defensive positions to forest and underground areas. One excerpt, signed by General Lieutenant Karl Graf von Spreti, declared, "The city, once a shield, now becomes a trap. The enemy does not respect the stone, he pierces it." It was the belated recognition that the last German hope, the walls of its cities, was crumbling under an artillery that not only destroyed but chose what to destroy. Meanwhile, the US was already studying a new application for the M1, the selective penetration of critical infrastructure, bridges, viaducts, factories. The 240mm Howitzer was no longer just a tactical weapon and became a strategic scalpel. For the first time in the history of modern warfare, a super-heavy artillery piece operated with a margin of error of less than 20 meters in urban areas. The superiority was not only one of caliber, but of control, and the impact of this was measured not in craters but in accelerated surrender decisions. Aschaffenburg's own defense commander admitted after his capture, "We did not resist for lack of faith, we resist for lack of an alternative, but they knew where to shoot, and that's what broke us." The M1 Howitzer now crossed the battlefield boundaries. It entered the cities, penetrated the ideological foundations, and operated as an instrument for dismantling the very notion of shelter. But what would come next would go beyond destruction. It would be the entrance to the Reich underground, in the hidden factories, in the final bunkers. And for this, the Americans were preparing an even more precise offensive. Because the next target was not just a military position, it was the industrial heart of Germany. With each shot from a 240-meter M1 Howitzer, 163 kilograms of steel and explosives traveled more than 23,000 yards until they destroyed a carefully designated target. But the real path to victory began long before the gunpowder was ignited. It began in the factories of upstate New York, in the long sheds of Watervliet Arsenal, where warheads were machined with decimal precision under the constant noise of hydraulic lathes and calibration presses. From that point, each shell embarked on a journey that crossed continents. They traveled by rail to the industrial ports of the East Coast, stored in reinforced compartments of Liberty ships, crossing the Atlantic in convoys protected by destroyers and escort ships. When they landed on the French or Italian coast, they were transferred to the Army's logistics depots, where the average time between arrival and the front rarely exceeded 72 hours. Each month of 1944, about 35,240 mm shells crossed this logistical circuit with losses of less than 0.5%. An invisible but overwhelming statistic, because no gun fires if it is not fed. And the American artillery was voracious. The secret was in the redundancy. The supply chain wasn't a line, it was a mesh. If one port was damaged, another absorbed the cargo. If a train derailed, Red Ball Express trains took over the transport by land. Most impressively, ammunition was transported along with spare parts, tools, spare engines, and even mobile maintenance kits. In a single month, the Allied supply system delivered more barrels of oil than all of Germany produced. The M1 Howitzers never waited for shells. The shells were already waiting for them. And that difference is what made each shot a certainty, not a gamble. The logistics were not only efficient, it was preemptive. Artillery commanders received weeks in advance weather forecasts and optimal replacement routes integrated into the tactical planning system. This meant that even before an offensive was approved, the shells were already positioned a few kilometers from the front in camouflaged shelters, protected by engineering units and ready for deployment. It was a war where response time was no longer determined by bravery or luck, but by organization. And in this, Germany was at an irreversible disadvantage. Its heavy artillery, often superior in range or single caliber, was dependent on a fragmented, sabotaged and inflexible rail network. The collapse of a bridge could silence an entire sector. The Americans, with their GMC trucks and networks of outposts, had the equivalent of a high-pressure circulatory system in the field. The ammunition flowed, and with it, destruction. During the Saarland offensive in February 1945, the 697th Battalion fired 1,132 240mm shells in 5 days. No supply failure was recorded. No projectile was left unreplaced. At the same time, German reports from the X-6V Corps pointed out that, due to lack of transport, their 210mm guns had gone 3 days without receiving heavy ammunition. The sector commander, General Anton Dostler, wrote in his diary, "They fire as if they had infinite ammunition, and we as if iron were rationed." The phrase wasn't just an observation, it was a confession. War was no longer decided by the pipe alone, but by what fed it. The American system even predicted terrain failures. M2 portable bridges and Bailey ferries allowed the ammunition convoys themselves to cross rivers under attack. M6 tractors towed the M1s even in deep mud, and each unit came with self-repair kits for sighting handles, breeches, and recoil mechanisms. A walking arsenal. Each shot was part of a symphony of planning, and even the most powerful of projectiles was only the last movement of a score written months in advance. The Germans could calculate the caliber, but they could not predict the flow. At a secret meeting of the German General Staff in March 1945, captured documents reveal that General Alfred Jodl is quoted as saying, "The difference between us and the Americans is that they treat war as an industry, and us as art." The phrase, though charged with resignation, captured the spirit of the collapse. The beauty of tactics was being defeated by the coldness of logistics, improvisation through repetition. And the numbers were unappealable. For each 240 millimeters of projectile fired, the Americans had moved 47 people, 3 vehicles, 6 approval documents, and a sequence of actions that began many times in an office in Kansas. The shot was just the tip of the spear. The entire body was invisible but fatal. This system allowed the U.S. to operate simultaneous offensives on multiple fronts without exhaustion. By the spring of 1945, while one battalion of M1s was operating on the eastern Rhine front, another was already positioning itself on the Austrian border. On average, the U.S. kept 8 to 12 howitzers in operation per active sector, with continuous rotation and preventive maintenance. The American war was not a marathon. It was an assembly line in the field, and the enemies, one by one, were being dismantled with the precision of an industrial clock. American superiority was not just a factory feat. It was a triumph of anticipation, and every bunker that collapsed before it was even used, every fortified line that collapsed without resistance, was the result of a gear that never stopped. Because in the end, the M1 didn't win because it was bigger, he won by always being ready. And the next target would require just that, an artillery operation against Nazi Germany's central nervous system, the underground bunkers of secret armaments factories. And there, even the concrete trembled. At the end of 1944, something unprecedented began to appear in the official documents of the German High Command. For the first time in the entire war, defense guidelines included an explicit recommendation: avoid prolonged sojourn in fixed fortifications at risk of super-heavy fire. It was the quiet collapse of a doctrine that had underpinned decades of military strategy. The fortress, once a symbol of Germanic resistance, was now seen as a death sentence. The German 7th Army, responsible for critical sectors on the Western Front, updated its campaign manual in December 1944. Appendix 3 read, "Considering the observed effects of the new Allied artillery armament, bunkers should be treated as temporary positions. Prefer mobile shelters or disconnected underground." Germany, surrounded, cornered, and drained of resources, was beginning to retreat, not just in territory but in belief. She retreated from herself. The doctrine that had guided the construction of the Siegfried Line, the Ruhr complexes, and the mountain bunkers in the Alps was being abandoned in practice, not by strategic decision, but by imposition of reality. Reports from Wehrmacht engineer troops, dated February 1945, mention unacceptable losses in occupied fortifications and suggest the use of deceptive positions with residual heat to draw in enemy fire. Fake bunkers began to be built with heated oil drums connected to ventilation pipes to simulate human occupation. It was a shadow war, and German desperation was no longer tactical, it was symbolic. The fortification had become a trap, and worse, a predictable trap. The irony of this story is that the solution was in front of them. If you're enjoying unraveling these facts and understanding how industrial logic has won over military myth, show your support. Like and subscribe so we can continue to bring you more in-depth content and eye-opening documents. What happened in 1945 was not just a series of battles, it was the collapse of a paradigm. The Americans, by contrast, doubled down on predictability. The 240mm M1 didn't need to adapt. It just had to follow protocol. Precision, volume, and logistics did the rest. On the German side, however, the doctrinal chaos intensified. In March, German army units began receiving instructions to disconnect their fixed lines of communication whenever an American observer was identified. The fear was no longer of the shot, but of triangulation. They knew that a radio, binoculars, and a slide rule were enough to transform a reinforced concrete bunker into a burial chamber. They tried countermeasures, noise generators, electromagnetic interference, thick smoke screens. None worked. The useful life of a fixed position in front of M1 was, on average, 7 minutes after detection. A classified document, captured in April 1945, bore the stamp "Nur für den Dienstgebrauch," for official use only. Its contents were devastating. A list of more than 200 bunkers deemed strategically inactive because they could not be safely occupied. In practice, it meant that in a number of sectors, fortification was being abandoned as a military concept. No soldiers, no command, no function, a structural burden. Germany, which had staked its final defense on stone and steel engineering, now watched its own doctrine become irrelevant. The shock even affected the morale of the troops. Infantry units that had previously sought protection in bunkers began to avoid them, preferring makeshift ditches, natural slopes, or even caves. The German army's medical reports indicate a significant increase in cases of seismophobia, the irrational fear of vibrations in the ground. Soldiers began to interpret any tremor as a harbinger of a howitzer attack. The bunker, conceived as a sanctuary, had become a symbol of anxiety. The place that was supposed to welcome was now suffocating. The shelter he would protect, he killed. And this reversal, slow, psychological, doctrinal, corroded the soul of an army still in combat. More than territories, Germany was losing control over its own military narrative. During the conference of the Wehrmacht High Command in April 1945, held in Berchtesgaden, an anonymous officer, according to the minutes recovered by the Allies, is reported to have said, "We build walls to hold back the advance, but they build numbers to tear them down. We are in the wrong era." It was a lament and an admission. Static warfare, the fortress, the fixed post, the doctrine of the continuous line, everything collapsed in the face of a new logic, the war of artillery mobility, of logistical calculation, of predictable destruction. When the Americans crossed the Rhine with 240 mm artillery following the advance of mechanized infantry in real time, it was clear that Germany no longer had anywhere to hide. German defense maps, once dotted with bunker symbols, began to be redrawn with lines of retreat. Defense is no longer a position, it has become a movement. But even the movement did not escape the eyes that came from the sky and the bullets that came from behind. The war was now controlled by a gear far larger than any Maginot Line, a gear that fired without hesitation, refueled without pause, and calculated with mathematical precision the collapse of any structure that tried to resist. But history still reserved one last blow of reality, because even in the face of the collapse of cities, unimaginable logistics and fire superiority, there was one last stronghold, an underground bunker, hidden in the bowels of an industrial valley, the ultimate symbol of German technical endurance, and it was there that M1 proved for the last time that no shelter was eternal. With the end of the war, while the world's spotlight was on courts, treaties, and occupation zones, another kind of silent mission took place among the rubble of the Third Reich. Soviet technicians, generals, and engineers roamed the fields of Western Germany with notebooks in hand, measuring craters, collecting scraps of steel, and analyzing what was left of German defensive positions. The surprise was immediate. What their own Katyusha guns and rocket launchers had failed to destroy in years of brutal advance on the Eastern Front, fortified bunkers, entrenched positions, buried command centers, had been reduced to concrete crushed by surgical fire from American 240 mm Howitzers. Marshal Vasily Tuikov, decorated in Stalingrad and Kursk, declared after visiting the remains of a bunker complex south of Aachen, "They have found the solution we have been looking for years, not mass, but precision." That remark, uttered with astonishment and respect, sealed a truth that even the Soviets had acknowledged. The Americans had reinvented artillery. While the Red Army was building its doctrine on fire saturation and infantry mobility, the United States had invested in something less visible but more deadly: calculation. Each firing of the M1 was preceded by tens of minutes of measurements, coordinates, weather adjustments, and synchronization. It was a war where the brain weighed more than the muscle, and the Soviets knew they would need to learn. The USSR's military intelligence teams included the M1 in the list of priority technologies for reverse analysis. Technical diagrams, photographs of craters, even samples of the cartridge cases were taken to Moscow. American doctrine, once viewed with disdain by Soviet rigidity, now became an object of study. What for the Germans had been terror, for the Soviets became strategic admiration. The most concrete evidence of this recognition came 2 decades later, in 1971, when the Red Army introduced the 2S4 Tulpan, a 240 mm self-propelled Mortaio, designed not to saturate, but to eliminate high-endurance targets with individualized fire. With a reduced rate of fire but unprecedented penetrating power, the 2S4 was the indirect admission that American artillery of World War II had left a deep scar on global doctrine. The M1 was not just a weapon of occasion. It was a philosophical turn, a break with the idea that volume of fire would win any battle. The Soviets understood this early on, and they adapted. In 1946, confidential NKVD reports mentioned the critical vulnerability of static fortification in the face of precision artillery with a programmable fuse. In response, the Red Army began a study of structure dispersion and dynamic camouflage, lessons that, ironically, had been taught not by Nazi Germany, but by the United States. The war at that point had already been won, but the doctrine, that survived. And M1's biggest victory may not have been on the field, but in the opponent's head. What the Germans derided as slow and clumsy artillery had proven efficient, reliable, and strategic. What the Soviets called overcalculation proved to be the difference between destroying and just damaging. And in the end, when the bunker pieces were examined by foreign hands, there was no doubt. The power of the M1 had outstripped its tactical function. It has become a technical reference. Respect for the enemy, sealed not by ideology, but by direct observation, was the ultimate attestation of the superiority of the American system. But there was still one untold chapter, the fate of the Howitzer himself. What happened to him after the war? How did such a powerful weapon come to be quietly removed from arsenals? And why, decades later, did he again inspire secret projects in arsenals of distant nations? The legacy of the M1 had not yet been fully fired, and its ultimate impact would come not in steel, but in doctrine. In the decades following the silence of the cannons, when Europe was covered in reconstruction and treaties, something persisted. Not in the camps, but in the corpses. The sound of the M1, which once echoed among hills and fortresses, never left the ears of those who heard it up close. For the American veterans of the 697th and 265th Battalions, the victory had a specific sound, grave, long, deafening. The metallic stampede that preceded the retreat of tons of steel was followed by seconds of tense silence, and then the distant sound of rupture. With each shot, the structures vibrated, the viscera contracted, and the eardrums seemed to give way. Many never heard fully again. A 1952 study by the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs concluded that 64% of M1 operators developed some degree of permanent deafness, but the hearing loss was only the most visible physical symptom. The real damage was psychological. Reports collected by military psychologists reveal common patterns among the men who handled the Howitzer: recurring nightmares with the sounds of gunshots, anxiety crises in closed spaces, inability to go to places with intense mechanical noise. Sergeant David Mathesy, recoil and lift operator of the 265th's No. 3 gun, described in a letter to the family, "Sometimes I lie down and feel like the whole world is about to explode. I know it's just my head, but the sound doesn't come out." The irony was brutal. The weapon that symbolized precision and control left the mark of disorder on its operators. The Howitzer won the war, but fragmented its own soldiers. On the German side, the effect was no less devastating. Dr. Hans Müller, a field psychiatrist at the Wehrmacht, published a study classified as vertraulich, confidential, in 1947, in which he coined the term Bunkerangst, persistent fear of post-impact confinement. The report described soldiers who, even in hospitals, refused to stay in windowless rooms, men who trembled at the sound of slamming doors, some that did not tolerate radios or combustion engines. One soldier reported, "I hear the sound before I go to sleep. It's not the impact. It is the silence between the shot and the explosion. This empty space tears me from the inside." This gap between cause and consequence was the true sensory legacy of M1. It didn't just destroy structures, it destroyed anticipations. He turned time into a trap. The impact was so profound that in the 1960s, German urban planners avoided building civilian shelters in shapes similar to war bunkers. Architects, aware of the collective trauma, altered ventilation patterns, clarity and depth of the public basements. An entire generation has come to associate shelter with prison and security with deathly silence. The sound of the M1 has become a cultural ghost, not only remembered but avoided. In 1979, during a NATO exercise in southern Germany, the firing of a 203mm piece sparked panic in elderly residents of a nearby village. It was not the same caliber, but it was the same fear. Americans also carried invisible scars. Operators who won battles felt ashamed of their role. A former officer interviewed in 1985 stated, "I didn't see the enemy, I only received coordinates. With each shot, I knew that dozens died, not by my hands, but by my mathematics. Technical dehumanization, so vital to the efficiency of war, took its toll on peace. Many were silent for decades. There was no medal to make up for the deafening silence left inside them. The war ended in 1945, but for these men, it persisted in echoes, pulsations in the ear, and memories that never dissolved. If American engineering has built the perfect weapon, it has also built a perfect moral dilemma. The victory had been won with logic, steel, and precision. But in the heart of each operator, there remained a silent question. At what cost? The sound that once represented the liberation of cities, the rupture of fortresses, and the advance of democracy, has become a symbol of a divided memory. Between pride and regret, between silence and noise, between victory and trauma. But the story is not over yet. Because even with all these marks, the legacy of the M1 would still manifest itself on a final battlefield, not physical, but doctrinal. The world would witness, years later, the return of the concept that the howitzer embodied: precision with weight, calculation with destruction, engineering with intention. And when a new generation of weapons is conceived, they would not be inspired by the fastest tanks, nor by the most agile planes. They would be inspired by a gun that fired a few times, but with absolute results. For millennia, civilizations have erected walls to survive time. From Masada to Verdun, concrete, stone, and steel were treated as symbols of permanence, of order in the face of chaos. But in 1944, on the hills of Cassino, on the flanks of Normandy, on the walls of Nuremberg, this belief began to crumble under a new sound, the firing of a howitzer that did not respect tradition. The 240mm M1 wasn't just a weapon, it was a sentence. He didn't just destroy physical targets, he destroyed the concept of invulnerability. Fortresses that took years to build were gone in seconds. Positions that required months of engineering disappeared under a single shot. What was at stake was not just territory, but an idea that concrete could stop time. The message of the American artillery was different. It doesn't matter what one builds, if on the other side there is a mind capable of imagining its destruction with precision, method, and scale. The real power does not reside in the wall but in the spreadsheet. The M1 was the embodiment of America's collective intelligence. Thousands of factory workers, engineers, mathematicians, and strategists, all aiming at the same point, the future. And in that future, there was no room for the arrogance of solidity. The gun spoke a new language where verbs were logistical, adjectives were industrial, and periods came with a 360-pound impact. The M1 said, "Fortresses are mental moats. Thinking that something is unattainable is the first step towards its downfall." And if the Reich believed that the world could be walled off, America responded with precision fire. Because in the end, it was not steel that won. It was the idea that no structure, no matter how thick, resists the collective will to overcome it. But the silence that followed the last shot of the M1 did not only mark the end of a doctrine. He was announcing another truth, a truth that the final part of this story must reveal. The 240mm M1 howitzer didn't just end battles, it ended an era. Each shot that sprayed German concrete marked the collapse of an age-old idea that physical structures could hold back the advance of human will. Nazi Germany, with its unwavering belief in fortifications, engineering, and rigidity, was defeated by an invisible enemy in trenches: the system. It wasn't just explosive power that won out, it was the uninterrupted flow of materials, the precision of calculations, the synchrony between man and machine. The static doctrine of the Reich collapsed in the face of an adversary who thought in a network, acted with elasticity, and produced like no other. And so the thesis is rigorously confirmed: the industrial and logistical power of the United States has not only broken walls, but dissolved the very ideological spine of the German resistance. The real lesson of this war is not in the maps, but in the spreadsheets. Logistics determines the strategy. Volume trumps tactical arrogance. Adaptability beats rigidity. Amid the ruins of indestructible bunkers, General Alfred Jodl summed up the irony that runs through this story. We were defeated by men with more trucks than ideas. If you value serious research and the reconstruction of historical facts without filters, support this work. Leave the like, subscribe, and activate the bell. Your action keeps alive the memory of truths that cannot be forgotten. And in the comments say, what was the most shocking data you discovered today? War changes form, but its lessons remain. Don't go away yet. Listen to the next true story that will appear on the screen. Always remember, logistics determines strategy. Watch the next video here on the channel with another incredible story.